under the glare of the studio lights with Steve Harvey just 10 feet away. This wasn't a game show for my family. It was a pressure cooker, and our last hope rested on an answer no one expected. The buzz of the studio lights was hot, a constant hum that felt like it was vibrating right through my bones. From my living room couch, everything on TV looked so polished, so effortless. But standing here, under the glare, with Steve Harvey's impossibly white teeth gleaming just 10 feet away, it was a different world. It was a pressure cooker, and my family and I were simmering right on the edge of boiling over. We weren't the typical game show family. We weren't bubbly, loud, or decked out in matching custom-made t-shirts. We were just desperate. My dad, Mark, stood beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was a man who smelled of old paper and quiet dignity. For 30 years he'd owned a small bookstore called The Dusty Page. It wasn't just a business, it was his sanctuary, a community hub where kids discovered their first literary loves and old-timers debated philosophy over lukewarm coffee. But times had changed. A giant online retailer had choked the life out of his dream, and a final notice from the bank was sitting on our kitchen table, a crisp white death warrant for everything he'd ever built. The $20,000 grand prize from Family Feud wasn't for a new car or a lavish vacation. It was the exact amount needed to pay off the final loan and keep the lights on at the Dusty Page. This wasn't a game for us. It was a last-ditch, televised prayer. My mom, my younger brother Leo, and my Aunt Carol stood behind us, their smiles looking as fragile as spun glass. Every time the camera panned to them, they'd clap and cheer, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the frantic hope in their eyes. We'd somehow scraped our way through the main rounds against the Parkers, a ridiculously cheerful family from Ohio who seemed to genuinely be having the time of their lives. We were tied, 290 to 290. This was the final face-off question. The winner goes to fast money. The loser goes home with nothing but a story. Steve Harvey read the question, his voice booming with its signature cadence. All right, listen up. We surveyed 100 people, top 6 answers on the board. Name something a person might pull out in a moment of panic. Bzzzt. My hand, slick with sweat, had slammed the buzzer before my brain even registered the question. It was pure instinct, a jolt of adrenaline. I was facing off against the Parker family patriarch, a guy named Dave with a big, friendly mustache. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The whole game, my dad's store, everything, came down to this single answer. All right, son, you were first. What you got for me? Steve's eyes twinkled. He was expecting a classic Family Feud answer. Something funny, maybe a little bit suggestive. The studio audience was already tittering in anticipation. My mind went completely blank. It was a white wall of static. Panic. What do you pull out in a panic? Keys, phone, wallet. The obvious logical answers were right there, floating just out of reach. But my brain wouldn't grab them. Instead, it flashed an image of my dad from a few weeks ago. He was sitting at his desk in the back of the store after closing time, his head in his hands, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills. He hadn't known I was watching from the doorway. The look on his face wasn't just sadness. It was the hollowed-out expression of a man who had given everything and was about to lose it all. That was panic. Real, soul-crushing panic. I stammered, the studio lights feeling hotter than ever. The audience's light laughter died down, replaced by an expectant silence. Dave Parker was staring at me, a confident smirk on his face. He knew the obvious answers. He was ready to steal if I missed. Come on now, son, talk to me, Steve encouraged, leaning in. And then the word just fell out of my mouth. It wasn't an answer I thought of. It was an answer I felt. It was the only thing my family had been clinging to for the past 6 months. It was the invisible currency we'd been trading in when our real bank account was empty. Hope, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The silence in the studio was absolute. It was so profound you could hear the faint buzz of the electronics. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Dave Parker's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion. I glanced back at my family. My mom's hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide. My dad just stared at me, his face unreadable. Steve Harvey didn't move. For the first time all night the showman was gone. The jokes, the exaggerated reactions, the wide-eyed mugging for the camera, it all melted away. He just looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was a mix of pity, curiosity, and something else, something deeper. He held my gaze for what felt like an eternity. The entire rhythm of the show had been broken by that one simple word. He finally broke the silence, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You said, hope." I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "Yes, Steve, hope. Because when everything else is gone, sometimes that's the only thing you have left to pull out." Steve stared at me for another long moment, then slowly turned his gaze from me to the big, empty board behind him. The crowd was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. He shook his head slowly, a strange, weary look on his face, as if he was seeing the game show for what it was for the very first time. He took a deep breath, looked back at me one last time, and then addressed the board, his voice uncharacteristically low and serious. "All right. I don't even know what to say to that. Let's see if hope is up there." The iconic board remained dark. The digital lines that would form the letters of a correct answer stayed dormant. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath with me. Then a sound I'd been dreading all night ripped through the silence, a harsh electronic bzzzt. A giant red X flashed beside my name. It felt less like a game show buzzer and more like a judge's gavel coming down on my father's life. One strike. A collective groan rippled through the audience. It was a sound of genuine disappointment, as if they, too, had been rooting for the impossible. I chanced to look back at my family. My mom's forced smile had crumbled, and Aunt Carol was wringing her hands. My dad just gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of disappointment. It was one of understanding, and somehow that felt worse. I hadn't just lost a point. I had laid our family's fragile heart bare on national television, only to have it stamped with a big red X. The game show persona snapped back onto Dave Parker's face. The brief moment of humanity was gone, replaced by the killer instinct of a competitor. This was his chance to steal, to win the game for his family. He puffed out his chest. Ready. But Steve Harvey didn't turn to him. Not yet. He kept his eyes on me. "You know," Steve said, his voice resonating with a strange, somber quality that hushed the studio once more. "We've been doing this show for a long time. People say all kinds of things up here. Crazy things, funny things, stupid things. But I don't think I've ever heard an answer that was so wrong, but felt so right." He shook his head again, looking past me, past the cameras, as if he was speaking to someone in the control booth. "Hope." The kid said, "Hope." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound that seemed to carry more weight than just a missed answer. It felt like he was tired of the game itself. Finally, he turned to the Parkers, his professional smile looking like it was physically painted on. "All right, Parkers, chance to steal. If it's up there, you win the game, and you're playing for $20,000. Name something a person might pull out in a moment of panic." Dave Parker didn't hesitate. He was back in the zone. "My phone, Steve. To call for help," he boomed. It was a good answer. A perfect answer. A soulless, pragmatic, 100-person surveyed kind of answer. It was everything mine wasn't. Steve turned back to the board, his face a mask of resignation. "His phone," he repeated, the energy drained from his voice. The board lit up. Ding. The space at the very top, the coveted #1 spot, filled with glowing letters. Phone. Cell phone. 92 people had said it. The studio erupted. Sirens and bells blared. The Parker family screamed and jumped into a massive group hug, their matching neon green t-shirts a blur of manufactured joy. It was over. We had lost. The warmth of the light suddenly felt cold. The cheering of the crowd felt distant, like it was happening in another room. All I could see was my dad's face. He was clapping, forcing a smile for the cameras, but his eyes were glassy. 30 years of work, of putting every spare dollar and every waking hour into a place filled with stories. And it was all going to end. And I had been the one at the buzzer when the final bell tolled. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. A stage manager was already starting to guide us off to the side, preparing to bring the Parkers to the center stage for fast money. The dream was dead. But then something happened that wasn't in the script. Hold on, Steve Harvey said, his voice cutting through the celebratory music. He held up a hand, not to the audience, but to the crew. The music sputtered and died. The stage manager froze. The Parker family stopped their hugging, looking confused. Steve wasn't looking at them. He was looking at us. He unclipped his microphone from his tie and started walking towards our podium, the handheld mic now in his hand. He walked right past the winning family as if they weren't even there. The cameras, after a moment of confusion, swung around to follow him. He stopped directly in front of me and my father. The studio was dead silent again. There were no flashing lights, no sound effects. There was just Steve Harvey, looking at my dad with an intensity that stripped away all the artifice of the show. "Mark, is it?" he asked, his voice low and serious. My dad, stunned, just nodded. "Yes, sir." Steve looked from my dad's worn-out sport coat to his calloused hands. "Your son said hope. That's a heavy answer for a game show, man. People don't just say that for no reason." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Forget the game. Forget the cameras. Tell me about the bookstore." My dad looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an 18-wheeler. We were supposed to be smiling, clapping for the other family, and then shuffling off stage into anonymity. We were not supposed to be the center of attention after a loss. This wasn't how the show worked. I could see the conflict warring on his face, the ingrained politeness of a man who never wanted to cause a scene versus the raw, bleeding wound of his life's work being discussed on national television. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at me, then at my mom, who gave him a tiny, encouraging nod. He took a shallow breath, his hands finally coming out of his pockets to rest on the podium. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that seemed to command the entire studio's attention. "It's called The Dusty Page," he began, his voice raspy with emotion. "I opened it 30 years ago. It's more than just a shop. It's a place where stories live. We have a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird that a customer sold me for a song because he wanted it to be somewhere it would be cherished. We have a reading corner where I've watched 3 generations of kids from the same family learn to love books." He swallowed hard, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were seeing the store right there in front of him instead of the studio audience. "It's not just about selling paper and ink, Mr. Harvey. It's about community. It's about having a place where you can go and just be quiet for a minute. The world is so loud now." Steve Harvey didn't interrupt. He just listened, his head tilted, the microphone held steady. The cameras were tight on my dad's face, capturing every flicker of pain and pride. The Parker family, who should have been celebrating, stood off to the side, their victorious smiles replaced with expressions of awkward sympathy. They were no longer the winners. They were just spectators to a story far more compelling than their win. "But people don't buy books from little shops anymore," my dad continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength, a sad resignation creeping in. "They click a button. The book arrives in a box the next day. It's convenient, I get it. But they miss the feel of it, the smell of the paper, the hope of finding something on a shelf you never knew you were looking for." He looked directly at Steve. "We took out a loan a few years ago to try and stay afloat, modernize a little. We're about to default. The $20,000 from this show, that was it. That was our last hope." He said the word without any of the shame I felt. He said it like a fact. The sun rises in the east. The world turns, and hope was the last thing on his balance sheet. The silence that followed was thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was something heavier. Respect, maybe. A shared sense of loss for something the world was carelessly discarding. Steve Harvey stood motionless for a long beat. He looked down at the floor, then back up at my dad. The jokester, the entertainer, was gone. In his place was just a man, listening to another man's quiet heartbreak. "You know," Steve said, his voice gravelly, "my father was a coal miner in West Virginia. He worked his whole life in the dark so I could have a little bit of light. He taught me that you don't measure a man by the money in his pocket. You measure him by the dirt on his hands and the integrity in his heart." He looked around the gaudy, flashing set, at the giant board with its survey answers. "We play this game for money. We laugh. We have a good time. But what you're talking about, what you've built for 30 years, that's worth more than any grand prize." He turned away from my dad and faced the audience, the cameras, and the entire world watching at home. His face was set with a resolve I had never seen before. "We're in the business of entertainment, but every now and then we get a chance to be in the business of doing the right thing." He walked back towards the center of the stage, leaving my family and me standing at our podium in stunned silence. He stopped beside the Parkers, who looked utterly bewildered. "Parkers," Steve said, his voice now booming with authority, but lacking its usual playfulness. "Congratulations. You won the game, fair and square. You're going to play fast money for $20,000. He paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. "But right now, I'm only putting $10,000 on the line for you." A confused murmur spread through the audience. Dave Parker's mouth opened, a question forming on his lips. Before he could speak, Steve Harvey raised his hand and turned, pointing directly at my dad. "Because the other 10,000, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "I'm giving it to him. Right now. Out of my own damn pocket." The studio audience erupted. It wasn't the polite, prompted applause from earlier. It was a roar. A wave of thunderous, spontaneous sound that washed over us, so powerful I could feel the vibration in my teeth. People were on their feet, clapping, whistling, some even wiping tears from their eyes. My mom let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Aunt Carol was openly weeping, her face a mess of mascara and disbelief. And my dad, he just stood there, frozen, his face completely pale. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Steve Harvey held up his hands, but not to quiet the crowd. It was more of a gesture of finality, of a decision made. The producer, a frantic-looking man with a headset, was sprinting towards the stage from the wings, flapping his arms like he was trying to put out a fire. Steve saw him, gave a slight shake of his head, and the producer skidded to a halt just off camera, looking completely helpless. This was no longer a game show. This was Steve Harvey's show, in a way it had never been before. Now wait a minute. Dave Parker, the dad from the winning family, finally found his voice. It cut through the din, and the crowd slowly quieted, eager to hear the drama unfold. "Steve, that's an incredibly generous thing to do. But we won. Our family won. We're supposed to play for the 20,000. Steve turned to him, his expression unyielding. "You are. You're going to play for $10,000. And if you win it, you walk out of here with 10 grand you didn't have this morning. That's a good day." He then gestured towards my dad. "This man is about to lose his life's work. 30 years. His son stood up here and didn't give me a punchline. He gave me a piece of his soul. And I'm telling you, that's got to be worth something." A tense silence fell over the stage. The Parkers looked at each other. They were a nice family from Ohio, here for a fun vacation and a chance at some money. They hadn't signed up for a moral dilemma on national television. Dave Parker looked at his wife, who had a pained expression on her face. He looked at my dad, who still hadn't moved a muscle. He was trapped. If he argued, he looked like a greedy jerk in front of millions. If he accepted, he was losing half of his potential prize. I felt a surge of guilt. This was our fault. My stupid answer had derailed everything, created this incredibly awkward public spectacle. We were the sob story, the charity case. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But then Dave Parker did something I didn't expect. He took a deep breath, straightened his neon green t-shirt, and walked past Steve Harvey until he was standing right in front of my dad. The two men from two completely different worlds stood face to face. "Mark," Dave said, his voice earnest, "I'm a contractor. I build houses. I own my own small business, too. I know what it's like to sweat and bleed and pray that you can make payroll at the end of the week." He glanced back at Steve, then back to my dad. "What Steve is offering it's incredible. And he's right." He looked my father square in the eye. "But it's not his money to pledge." My heart sank. He was going to refuse. He was going to demand his full shot at the prize. The brief flicker of hope that had ignited in my chest sputtered and died. "It's ours," Dave continued, and the entire studio leaned in. "We won it, fair and square. We're entitled to play for that $20,000. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The producer was now nodding vigorously from the sidelines, looking relieved. Steve Harvey had a thunderous expression on his face, like he was about to step in and take over again. "So," Dave said, his voice firm and clear, "we're going to go play fast money, and we're going to try and win that $20,000. He then held out his hand to my dad. My father, looking confused and defeated, slowly took it. Dave gripped his hand tightly. "And when we win," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that sent a shiver down my spine, "we're giving you all of it." For the second time in less than 10 minutes, the studio was swallowed by an absolute pin-drop silence. No one breathed. No one moved. The producer, who had been on the verge of a victory dance, now looked like his headset had just delivered an electric shock. My dad's hand was still in Dave Parker's, and he was staring at him, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were trying to understand a foreign language. Steve Harvey's hard expression melted away. He looked from Dave to my dad, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It wasn't his big, flashy TV smile. It was smaller, warmer, and infinitely more real. He let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "I came out here thinking I was going to have to teach everybody a lesson about what's important. Turns out I'm the one getting schooled. He clapped Dave on the shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. All right then, contractor. You heard the man. Let's go play for $20,000. The energy in the studio shifted. It was no longer about a competition. It was a mission. The audience wasn't just cheering for the Parkers. They were cheering for us, for the Dusty Page, for the very idea that decency could still win. My family was ushered to the side of the stage, but not to the losers' waiting area. They brought chairs for us right near the front, like we were honored guests at our own execution, or our salvation. Dave and his eldest son, a lanky teenager named Josh, took their places for fast money. The pressure was immense. It was one thing to play for yourself. It was another thing entirely to play for a stranger's dream, with millions of people watching. Dave went first. He was a machine. Name a brand of toothpaste. Colgate. Ding. Something you find in a toolbox. Hammer. Ding. He moved through the questions with a steady, confident rhythm. He stumbled on one. Name a famous magician, drawing a blank before blurting out, Gandalf, which got a huge laugh, but he recovered quickly. When the buzzer sounded, he had scored 168 points. A very solid, but not unbeatable score. It would all come down to his son. Josh stepped up, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was just a kid, maybe 16 years old. The weight of two families was now resting squarely on his narrow shoulders. Steve put a comforting hand on his arm. All right, Josh, listen to me. Don't think about the score. Don't think about anything else. You and me, that's it. Let's have a conversation. You ready? Josh gave a shaky nod. The clock started. Name a brand of toothpaste. Crest. Bzitis. A duplicate answer. The audience groaned. My heart plummeted into my stomach. It was happening. They were going to fall just short. It's all right, son. Shake it off, Steve coached. Something you find in a toolbox. Screwdriver. Ding. A good recovery. He got the next one, too. He needed 32 points from the last 3 questions. It was possible, but the margin for error was gone. Name a famous magician. Josh paused. I could see the panic in his eyes. He was going to say Gandalf. I just knew it. The seconds ticked away. David Copperfield. Ding. 18 points. The audience cheered. He needed 14 more. Name a type of bear. Steve fired off. Grizzly. Ding. 29 points. He'd done it. They had won. But the final question was already being asked, the clock still ticking. Name something you might pull out in a moment of panic. The world seemed to slow down. Josh didn't even hesitate. Without a flicker of irony, without a moment of calculation, he looked Steve Harvey in the eye and said, with the simple clarity of a teenager who had just witnessed something extraordinary, Hope. Ding. The number one answer, phone, was already revealed. Hope wasn't on the board, of course. He got 0 points for it, but it didn't matter. The total score flashed on the screen. 215. The victory sirens blared, confetti cannons exploded, and the studio erupted into absolute chaos. The Parkers were swarmed by their family, hugging, crying, and celebrating. But after a moment, Dave Parker broke free from the group. He walked through the falling confetti, straight over to where we were standing, a giant novelty check for $20,000 in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just handed it to my dad. My dad looked down at the check, at the impossible number written out on it, and then he looked up at Dave. His face, which had been a mask of stoic tension all night, finally crumpled. He began to cry. Not loud, sobbing cries, but silent, streaming tears that cut paths through the dust of 30 years of quiet struggle. He pulled Dave into a hug, and the two men, the bookseller and the builder, stood there, holding on to each other as the confetti settled around them. Later, in the green room, away from the cameras, our two families mingled. There were no winners or losers. The Parkers refused to take a single dollar, not even when Steve Harvey, who had come back to see us, offered again to split it. Some things are more important, Dave's wife said, giving my mom a hug. You have a beautiful family, and a beautiful story. As we left the studio that night, blinking in the cool California air, the surreal energy of the show began to fade, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of gratitude. My dad held the check in his hands like it was a sacred text. The dusty page was safe. The next morning I woke up to the smell of old paper and fresh coffee. I went downstairs and found my dad in the living room, the check on the mantelpiece. He was holding one of his favorite books, a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea. He looked up at me, his eyes clear for the first time in months. You know, he said, his voice soft, I was angry at you for a minute last night, for your answer. He looked down at the book. I thought, after all this, we're going to lose because of some silly philosophical nonsense, but you weren't being philosophical, were you? No, I said, my throat tight. I was just being honest. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. It was the best answer you could have possibly given. He closed the book and set it down. It turns out, the one thing that wasn't on the board was the only answer that mattered. And in that quiet moment, I understood. We hadn't gone on a game show to win money. We had gone there to be reminded of what was truly valuable, and we came home richer than we ever could have imagined.